Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this discussion of an important subject at an important time. We are very pleased to have a distinguished panel of speakers. I will introduce them briefly in a second. The question, I don't think very difficult to answer, is antitrust, is competition now political? My answer to that is yes. It perhaps always was, perhaps always is, but there are certainly ups and downs in the relationship between competition policy, between competition law and political developments more generally. And this is the time when that relationship is particularly important. I think it would be wrong, it would be naive to suggest that there was ever a time when it wasn't. Any careful analysis, a little bit of archaeology into the merger regulation, indeed into the treaty rules, will throw up pretty obvious traces of epic battles of the past, which were political as well as policy and as well as legal. Should come as no surprise, I think, that this particular moment is one in which there is a newly invigorated debate about the role, the purpose, the direction of competition law. It's therefore a big moment, a good moment, I think, to bring together this very distinguished panel. We have Salome Cisnaldo-Ugarte, who is the managing partner at Hogan Lovells in Brussels. We have Thomas Janssens, who is the global head of Antitrust, Competition and Trade at Freshfields. We have Professor Tommaso Valletti, who is head of the Department of Economics and Public Policy at Imperial College in London, former chief economist at DG Competition at the European Commission. And this is strictly alphabetical order, by the way, we finish with Ingrid van den Bore, who is head of the Brussels office, distinguished competition lawyer at Skadden. I am pleased that we at Brunswick are hosting this with Forum Europe, whom we thank for what I'm sure will be the excellent organization and the technical side of what is happening today. I'm chair of European Public Affairs at the Brunswick Group, having behind me a very long career at the European Commission, from which I retired at the end of 2016. Don't ask me why. Let's therefore begin to consider the questions which I think will help us frame this debate, the interaction between politics and the recent initiatives to change the way the law is applied, perhaps, and to reform the law itself. I think it's a legitimate question if politicians are to be involved in the framing of competition law, in the enforcement of competition law. Are they getting the best possible help and information to enable them to do that? And in what is, I think, completely uncontroversial in considering the role of politicians, are these systems in place for the scrutiny of those charged with the day-to-day enforcement of competition law? Are those scrutiny systems the right ones, and are they working properly? So let's move to the panel, and I will ask Salome to start with a few remarks.
Thank you, John. And well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to participate on this panel and on such a timely topic, a topic that indeed comes back every now and then. And my take to the question, is antitrust competition political, is yes, I completely agree with you that it is, and it has always been political. And this starts with the fact that the competition commissioner is, after all, a political appointee. So nowadays, Commissioner Bestea, well, Executive Vice President and Commissioner for Competition Bestea, has been appointed through a political process. She's also part of a commission that is bound to political priorities. So if we look at the program of President von der Leyen, she specifically mentions six political priorities. And these priorities are again emphasized in the mission letter that is addressed specifically to Vestea as the competition supremo. So there again, we say, President von der Leyen specifically mentions, I outlined 6 headline ambitions on which I want the European Commission's work to focus on. So clearly the political priorities are there. So there is a political direction for her work. And the 6 priorities, we all know them, but there are 3 of them which are of particular importance for the competition dossier. And let me just briefly refer to them. So a Europe that is fit for the digital age, a European Green Deal, and an economy that works for people. These are 3 objectives that are key for the mandate and for the work of Commissioner Vestea, and therefore for the work that is being undertaken in this area. Now, do these political priorities have an impact on enforcement? There, the answer is probably yes. So enforcement can be influenced by these political priorities. And just think about the recent sector inquiry into Internet of Things. Just think about the current consultation on sustainability to basically bring the European competition regime in accordance with the Green Deal. Just think about the whole digital regulation that is currently being discussed, the Digital Market Act, the Digital Services Act packages, etc. So there is indeed an impact on the enforcement. Now, my final point is, does this mean that enforcement can be influenced by politicians? So is there is this something that politicians should be involved in? There, my answer is no. And so the enforcement should not be, the process of enforcement should not be influenced by politicians. Enforcement should be fair, should be based on facts, and should be subject to the legal rules. And we can always think about examples like the Siemens-Alstom merger, and I'm sure that Thomas or even Ingrid will be referring to that. So this was an example where politicians were not allowed to intervene, and this is why I would not have proposed or would have not supported the French-German proposal to support European champions. So for me, again, and just to conclude, I think that in antitrust, political intervention should not play a role in terms of undermining the process, and for the purpose of fairness, predictability, and legal certainty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salome. Thomas.
Right. So in preparing for this, a colleague pointed me to an article from Bob Pitofsky from 1979, which actually is about politics and antitrust. And he suggested it would be bad history, bad policy, bad law to exclude certain political values in interpreting the antitrust law. So I thought it was funny to see that 40 years ago as a topic of discussion. I think in a way you can distinguish 3 aspects, and of course it's all about what you read into the word political. I think the way to see it, and I think that's consistent with what Salome said and what you said, Jonathan, by way of introduction, is that yes, ideology influences the way we apply the antitrust laws. Policy priorities influence this, and indeed that may evolve over time, and sometimes it's a little bit more emphasized. But indeed, if we look back, in Europe, the antitrust laws have also been used to sort of leverage liberalization of sectors like telecoms and energy. So I don't think that that's so different from what's going on now in relation to, say, digital or potentially sustainability ambitions. Then there's a second question, sort of, do you put political versus economic? I'm sure Tommaso will have views on that. I don't think necessarily they need to be contradicting each other, but I think some do, in terms of saying, well, the pure way of applying antitrust apolitically would be purely based on economic values, but I'm sure that ideology also influences economics. So yeah, welcome Tommaso's views on that. And then finally, there's the question, indeed, where does it become dangerous? If you look at political in the sense of meaning that the views of the enforcer on who wins or loses a case, who gets sued, depends on whether they're a friend or not, whether they can give something in return or not. So you get into sort of political meaning almost inappropriate. That's of course where you need to be careful. That's where you need the checks and balances in the system. So I think that's also consistent with what Salome was suggesting at the end there. So that's what I would sort of say in terms of big picture on those points.
Thank you very much. By the way, to the audience, let me say that we're going to open up to you, of course, at the end of the panel discussion. Please think about questions, post them in the chat section on the right of your screen. I can see that there's a ticker tape thing going down at the bottom saying just that. Good. Well, thank you very much, Thomas, and now Tommaso.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. The Christmas season has already started. We have to entertain ourselves, and so let's hope that this year finishes very soon and next year will be better. So I will start with some observations. So if I were still a good official of the Commission, so I've been an official, I don't know if I've been a good one, but the answer has already been given, which is, of course, the Commission is political. The Commission can give political priorities, the environment, digital, you name it. However, when it comes to the application, then we are strongly independent, and we should be. Fair enough, there's nothing against it, but then it's a sort of business as usual. And instead, I don't think it's business as usual now, and I will explain why. The other general consideration is that antitrust is just one of the many examples of what public policy calls thin political markets. These are called thin political markets because they represent processes through which complex and critical institutions are shaped and determined, but they're not salient. They're not salient. We vote on immigration, we vote perhaps on trade, we vote on taxation, but we don't vote on antitrust. Antitrust is just one, it's not the only one. Financial regulation, corporate reporting, auditing, there's other examples. So this is left to the experts. To the experts, we are the experts. So this panel is made of experts. So we contribute to this determination of thin political markets, and the experts are, of course, also representing corporations and power. And our small circle determines the rules of the game. So thin political markets are basically rather esoteric areas for the general public. I mean, try to go in the street and explain what you do, people will look at you and will not understand what you do, okay? And this is true for all of us. So as an academic, I actually thought that academia could shape the right answer, could be helpful. But this is my personal journey, and we talk about my own experience. I don't want to overgeneralize, but academics, we are as captured as anyone else. Okay? So, and we have become part of the problem, not part of the solution. All of us are part of the same problem. I don't think we are bringing in solution. So this matters, and we need to address it. So from these general considerations, I'm rather disenchanted, as you might have realized already by now, specifically about economics. I'm not talking about the legal profession. So the economists, and this is again part of my journey, we live in such a bubble. If I compare 30 years ago, economists, with our typical arrogance, we said that what was being done in competition policy was very hand-waving, was not based on principles. Before, everything was, just qualitative. And then the economists came along, perhaps with good intentions, and we said, we have the tools, we have the tests, we can measure. What we have produced in 30 years is a set of Mickey Mouse models, a set of boxes. Lawyers love us economists because we have two hands, so we are very useful in a sense. And these boxes are called merger simulation, vertical arithmetic, the SNP test, the as efficient competitor test. We talk about consumer welfare, saying that this is very flexible, but in fact, it means something very narrow. And we never ask ourselves, where are we going? What has happened to markets? What has happened to people? Never. Okay, we just look at a very narrow scope of our analysis, and we gave lots of expedients to everything to go through, basically. So, and we never wanted even to look at the impact. So if I think specifically of the monstrous remedies, the divestitures that we always try to find for any deal to go through, we never ask ourselves, what happened afterwards? What happened to the remedies? What happened to the trustees? Did it work? Did it not work? What happened to prices afterwards? What happened to investment afterwards? Never. In the meantime, other people from outside the field, it wasn't from us, have been noticing some historical trends, quite dramatic, which has been increases in concentration, increases in margins, decrease in the labor share, decrease in contestability of the markets, decrease in the entry of new firms. And this is across the board. It's in pharmaceutical, it's in telecommunications, it's in telecommunications, it's in, retailing, it's in big tech, obviously, all of this, okay? And again, our response from the inside was always to look for defensives. Oh, but these industrial trends have nothing to do with antitrust markets. Let's ignore it. The margins, but they don't account the fixed cost or the intangible. Let's ignore it. I can go on if you want. The point we've understood, we just are so happy to miss the bigger picture looking at, and I can tell you as an academic, I know exactly what are the weaknesses of each one of those kind of studies, but we are not interested in understanding them. So something has happened, the word has evolved. So populism has also come across, which has, and this is the novelty. So antitrust has become a topic, less esoteric for other people too. Less esoteric because it was part of the presidential campaign in the United States. And that's where, paradoxically, despite stagnation, despite paralysis in the US, most of the novelties are coming from. The limitation, of course, of populism is that it's a binary discourse, okay? It's 0-1, it's black or white. So it's very difficult to be in the middle with that kind of approach. But that's, I think, the only side where changes might come. So I tried, personally, for many years to stay in the middle, have incremental changes as it should be when it comes to policy. But with this kind of, how can I put it, unassailable antitrust elite doing changes from inside, I've seen it's virtually impossible because the interest groups of the corporation are very high. So we will probably experience, I mean, I'm not saying it's my preferred option, but I think we will experience a change in the pendulum, probably quite swift, and we will see whether this alternative in the next 20 years is going to be a better one or not. But this is where I think we are. These are my initial remarks. Thanks.
Thank you, Tommaso. Ingrid.
I was diligently being on mute. Let me maybe be the first to say that I will jet some disagreements into what's being said. I do disagree that it's not, I think that we've had some epiphany and realized that we never cared about consumers and consumption before, and now all of a sudden we see that there are externalities and there's a bigger picture. I don't think it's quite as simple as that. I think there's been an increasing complexity in our markets, in our services, in how markets function. Technology has developed very significantly, has advanced a lot, and these decisions on what is good for consumers are not easy anymore. There's a big difference on what is good for consumers in the long term and in the short run, for example. I don't think it's been the case that we've been blind. It is the case that it's not very clear anymore necessarily. And so there's much more scope for disagreement. It also creates scope for gaps because economics can't answer all the questions anymore. Because there is this uncertainty over the long run, we have gaps in our assessment. We've asked many times in the past years, how would economics address, big data issues and platform issues? And to some extent, economic analysis has said we can go to this point and not much further. In speculative, we think we'll find shortcuts in how we assess. I remember some of the articles that have been written, including by Carl Shapiro, to say we don't know what the impacts will be, but here are some shortcuts. Here's some easy hands to assess it. And so we've been satisfied with that because we've had to be, because our markets have become complex. And we see agencies increasingly forecasting what markets will do, assessing things on counterfactual, speculative. We've seen that much more because it's the only way to assess. I think the second development that we've seen is that there's been a much bigger complaint culture. If you look at the number of complaints that have come in to an agency like the Commission in the years, say, before 2005 or even 2010, and in the last 5 years, there's a dramatic difference. It's really dramatic. It's because there is much more of a culture of we will complain and we will look at assessment with agencies that are going to be proactive and engaging. And I think those developments has led to antitrust being something that is much more than the narrow framework that we've been used to applying. There's now antitrust plus. There's antitrust plus privacy. There's antitrust plus, data. The Digital Services Act is the perfect example of that. We've come to see as antitrust as having something more because we need to account for that assessment that's going to be broader because we don't know what the implications would be. And maybe one observation here, of course, the Digital Service Act, the Digital Markets Act, those have become very political instruments. And I mean, my observation is that we've seen a lot of lobbying now. I mean, we've seen again, the timing's been postponed, no doubt because of some of the lobbying and review going on. First it was the 2nd, the 9th, now we're at the 16th. There's clearly a machine behind that. And it's just interesting to observe that what we've not done in this context is look at the courts and how we can improve how the court system works, how the tools for courts will become better, whether we have specialized aspects of the court. We've looked at digital units in the enforcement authorities, not digital units in the courts, for example. And sort of I'm wondering whether there isn't more scope for looking at how courts can be good checks and balances, in addition to maybe this political process inevitably playing out, because there's increasingly disagreement on what constitutes what's good for consumers and what's not. And then the question is, who's going to make that determination? Whether it should be only this kind of lobbying exercise, because it will be, regardless of how we look at it, and whether we shouldn't have an increasing role for the courts in some way. So throwing that into the discussion, and I'll stop there.
Thank you very much indeed, Ingrid. Thanks to all of you. We now can turn to questions. I think we have a lot of things to think about. I have a few questions that have entered the chat section. Please bring some more in. I have one or two myself I'd like to ask. The first question from Pedro Rodriguez Duarte from the panel representation of Portugal. Thomas mentioned a study at the beginning of his introductory remarks. What was the study? Thomas, what was that?
So this is an article written in the, if I don't get it wrong, the University of Pennsylvania Law Review in 1979, as I said. So it's an article by Bob Pitofsky, at the time a professor, and who then went on to be an FTC commissioner and indeed head of the FTC. Happy to share the link to that article around as well.
Yes, I remember that article. It no doubt merits rereading. Then, second question from Oles Andrichuk, who is co-director of the Center for Internet Law and Policy at the University of Strathclyde, on supporting national champions. It's not a binary yes or no option. It's not an easy task. I think we can agree on that, even if we opt for it. Is this model less suitable in comparison to more integrated countries? The choice is not therefore simply yes or no, but yes or no, and if yes, how exactly we plan to do it. So if there were an avowed policy of supporting national stroke European champions, how would we do that? And perhaps I could combine that with Stephen Kinsella's question, is that the word political may cause a certain wariness. If we replace it by accountability, there might be more consensus that it's a good idea, but where should accountability lie? Should it be only to the courts? That isn't enough. How can political accountability be secured? Perhaps we'll pause there, and I will open that to the panel.
So I'll have a go. First, again, I just want to notice this curiosity that when enforcement is very lenient, as we had for a long time, it seemed like everything was going fine. There was no interference for politics or from populism. Now that there is a change in the direction, a swing of the pendulum, all of a sudden, so it's going in the direction of most likely more enforcement, all of a sudden everything is becoming politicized, which means probably based not on principles. So it's a one-sided view of when politics is good and when politics is bad. On the question that Oles and Stephen mentioned, I think perhaps it is good, at least for those of us which like to reflect in general terms, is once again to think about the goals that we have for antitrust. And if I leave Europe aside and I think of United States and I think of the Sherman Act, actually the enforcers more than 100 years ago drew upon a rich set of democratic anti-monopoly goals, such as preserving small businesses, such as ensuring that there were worker rights, such as there would be equal access to the marketplace, preventing political corruption, even freedom for fear of monopolists. That was the Sherman Act, which is we would all agree a very important piece of legislation. Those were goals wide, and they've been abandoned. So completely. Let's take an area which is perhaps less controversial for us, which is workers' rights. Okay, in 20 years of work in this area, I've never, and forget about the exceptions, please, look at the bigger picture. I never heard any discussion about workers, okay? They were an input, a factor of production. If anything, some concentration of market power could be efficient because it would lead wages down, and this would have an impact on cheaper prices for consumers, okay? That was at best the discussion, if ever any. However, the way we got there was using economic models from industrial organization that would assume at the outset that labor markets are perfectly competitive, okay? Or in the few occasions, we did a few bargaining models where the outcome would be cheaper wages by assumption, would drive prices down. We decided at the outset never to use another model which exists in economics tool, which is a model of monopsony, which is used by labor economists. It's a different field. It has never percolated in our area. But if you talk to a labor economist, they would say, yes, you may want actually to reduce output in order to drive wages down. And by the way, this has also a negative impact on consumers because less output is being produced. But this was never embedded in our model. So we ignored. It's not just that we ignored, and that was a political choice. We didn't consider. So we didn't even think that this could be a parameter of that we wanted to understand. So we need, I think, to refocus on the goals of what we want for our society. So yes, accountability is important, but this is a great discussion, and we want politicians to talk about this because, and we don't want to leave it to us only because we cornered ourselves. And as I said earlier, I think the entrenched of our comfortable positions is so strong that I don't see how from the inside that there can be ever any movement from the status quo.
Any other panelists want to comment on that, or shall we move to another set of questions?
Unless Salome or Ingrid have a point, I just maybe wanted to add one point on Stephen Kinsella's reference to accountability. So I think, I mean, in a way, obviously, yes, antitrust needs to take into account those various factors that at any given point in time are actually the priority of society. That can't be disconnected, and that will evolve over time. But I mean, to give you an example, the first case I worked on was the 25 years ago, the joint venture between France Telecom and Deutsche Telekom. Atlas Global One, and the European Commission made its approval conditional on a set of requirements, which were actually exactly the kind of points which they could not get through European Parliament because there was just not. And through the council, actually, because there was not political agreement on that. So they just used the shortcut of the antitrust case to push that through. And of course, you can say, well, that wasn't so bad because it's liberalization of the European telecoms markets, and that was positive. But certain people will say, no, I mean, that's where it all went wrong when we started liberalizing. So I think you need to be very careful also about saying, yes, we should be more courageous in antitrust and look at all these factors, where that risks shortcutting a democratic process. And that's where I think for example, the Digital Markets Act, I mean, if that gets delayed 1 week, 2 weeks, because there are discussions going on, I mean, I have no problem with that. That's part of a democratic process. I think the more important bit there is that some of those points get addressed indeed in a piece of legislation rather than through the back door of an antitrust case, whether it's a merger remedy or an antitrust investigation.
I think that is
I guess,
a valid point. Sorry, who was coming in there? Ingrid, please.
Yeah, so and it's interesting to see how we pitch it, right? Whether it's the back door of the courts or whether, the political process is saying, we're not going to wait for the courts. We're going to kind of do it this way, and whether it's one versus the other, whether it needs to be quite so bilateral, because the political process may be the back door of the lobbying exercise, right? And we may all revisit in 5 years whether a DMA was the best thing to call into life because it's very rigid, right? And some question the lack of flexibility on wielding a tool like that. Whether, for example, all the member states are going to have a different political kind of balance, and we'll start interpreting and applying something like the DMA very differently, and whether it's going to lead to fragmentation, whereas a much broader rule-based framework with court application may be a bit more kind of slow moving, as it were. I mean, I continue to think, I don't think we've had this big epiphany. I think it's just gotten a lot more complex, and people worry a lot more about understanding the implications. I mean, it's human nature to want to be where others are. It's human nature to think things are scarce, and those two factors lead to certain services having things like network effects, which has an inherent consumer benefit, right? And then one of the questions is, do we think as consumers we're looking at short term or we're looking at long term? That's true with things like climate and other things as well. And so it's probably not something court or political process, but probably a combination of the two. And maybe the court can help fashion implementation of the DMA over time. So I don't see them one as the back door versus the other.
But pulling together some of the threads, and there are other questions coming up on this about the choice of enforcement priorities. That is where there is a considerable role for the Commission in the EU setting. And let's assume that the Commission quite deliberately sets about enforcing the rules in a certain way to bring about, or at least incentivize, action at the political level where action is somehow blocked. So, for example, one version of history is that the merger regulation was stuck, that's a fact, in the Council, requiring unanimity for many years. The Commission took a number of decisions which in the 70s and 80s, which stretched the limits of articles at the time 85 and 86, 101, 102, usually up by court judgments, therefore given the force of law, which both brought about some sort of semblance of a rickety merger control system and encouraged everybody in the council to adopt a comprehensive, proper system of merger policy. That's one history, one part of the history of the merger regulation. And you can multiply that across other fields in which the Commission has used competition law to fill gaps and to incentivize political action where it believed, and it had some political backing for its view, that that was necessary. Bank resolution. It wasn't possible to get much progress on bank resolution mechanisms in the financial crisis in the Council of Ministers. The Commission used state aid law, approved state aid, and imposed conditions, echoing a little bit what Thomas said about telecoms and the whole saga of transport, telecoms, energy liberalization is much the same. The Commission used the treaty rules as they were to impose conditions, which later on ended up being the foundation of the liberalization and deregulation regulations. Is that legitimate? Question. The Competition Commissioner or the Commission, believing that that is the right course, should he or she have explicit political authorization to do that, or should that simply be a matter of apparently objective enforcement prioritization? So I think a very legitimate question is how priorities are set. Now, coming back to the questions, Auke Haagsma, former colleague, hello Auke, reminds us that a debate, which no doubt never goes away completely, but was particularly strong towards the end of the 20th century, about whether whether DG Comp should become an independent agency, was ruled out by the Commission, no doubt would be again, and the Director General at the time, resisting his own compatriots in Germany, took the view that it would weaken competition policy enforcement. It would weaken Commission, certainly, if that were to happen, even if, by the way, you could overcome all the legal, constitutional, Moroni-style questions. But that issue hasn't gone away. And the more the Commission says it's political, or now geopolitical, the more, again, I think of Wolfgang Schäuble in Germany, voices are heard, but not only in Germany, saying, well, you can't be an impartial law enforcement body and a political body at the same time. Something has to give. Well, does something have to give? That's the question. Another question going down the list from Bent Brabander, competition, political influence, the fact that the US is home to 14 of the world's 20 most valuable tech firms, whereas Europe has only one and Asia 5, can it be said that that plays no role in the formulation and enforcement of competition policy? What about the politics around the DMA? We have a number of questions about that. Says, I'm sure he's right, that a few weeks delay because of the internal processes of scrutiny in the Commission, in the grand scheme of things, hardly the. And this is the beginning of the democratic process. There will be, of course, a proposal debated in the normal way by the co-legislators. So how, at this early stage of the development of these, what will one day become rules, where do we think the politics stand?
On the American giants versus European minnows, this is interesting, but again, if we want, as we should, take a European perspective, then in this debate, we really want to make sure that we hear the voices of the possible European startups or the possible European entrepreneurs. We want to create a thriving, innovative landscape in Europe. So this is where you would need to listen less to those dominant companies in the US. By the way, these rankings to me are meaningless. Just looking at size and say you're great because you're number one. I mean, it's fairly dangerous. I prefer to have 20 good companies, even if they are not number one, as long as they are competing against each other, innovating and employing people and delivering good stuff. So, but so this is related to the DMA, DSA kind of debate. It's really important that we don't think of the impact that imposing interoperability, interconnection, ex-ante regulation might have on the incumbents, but how this might impact on the ambition of the investments of European startups near Cambridge, in Germany, in Lithuania, Estonia, and in the Baltic countries. These are the players that we need to hear. Instead, typically in this debate, at the main table, you have the CEOs of the top companies and not anyone else. Another question that was still your former colleague Auke is talking about the US, saying, but what about US judges? Again, I want to talk as an economist. I don't have enough experience in other fields. But the paradox in the US is that it's become even more esoteric to talk about economics. It's a game of power. You have two different sides. They will hire from the outside some top economists, typically some old foxes that perform well in front of the courts. They run arguments which are very difficult to understand for a judge. Judges themselves, who've been trained in simplistic economics by some think tanks, that's the Global Antitrust Institute, they have programs to train judges in economics which run for about a week, 10 days, that tell you how economics and competitive markets are great, and that's the status quo. And we are talking about instead giants, but the judges just hear what they've been brainwashed basically by something which is not the economics, definitely from academia in the past 30 years. But take as an example the AT&T Time Warner case. This was reduced to arguing. This was Carl Shapiro that was mentioned earlier. Again, one of the old foxes, a great economist, but then sold his soul to Google for the past 30 years. So he was actually used by the DOJ. But the argument that Carl Shapiro, this great economist, could bring forward was that consumers would be worse off, would end up paying 30 cents a month more with the merger. That was what economists could say, instead of an argument that AT&T and Time Warner would have a lot of power over the entire marketplace that nobody could make. And obviously the DOJ lost, and we see what's happening right now. So This is where we really need to reset the rules. I have some solutions, but we can leave it for later if you want. But the US case where people argue in court is not a good system either. So when you just bring your experts and the judge decides, has proven itself to have a lot of flaws.
Well, if I can jump in here, I think that, and also talking about the US, and a number of people have been asking about that. Well, the US is a very different system from ours, right? So in a way, it has to be seen separately from the EU system. But I think we are living, these are going to be very interesting times also in the US. I mean, we saw that, you know, Biden didn't really focus too much on antitrust. So I remember looking at the program, and it was not really impressive. And ultimately, the president can only, well, the influence it has is basically nominating the head of the agencies, right? So, you know, the political influence arguably is limited. At the same time, it will have an impact. And we have seen, I completely agree with Tommaso, that the antitrust enforcement in the US, I mean, particularly during the last years, has been lax, has been almost non-existent. So I think that, but there is going to be a complete change in terms of enforcement. Now, the judicial system, now the US, I mean, well, you have the ex ante rules, you have the legislation, you have the ex post enforcement, and then you have the judicial review that plays a very different role than in the European Union. I do not completely agree that it doesn't work well. I mean, I guess, well, you have different cases, but I think the judicial review, I mean, plays a much stronger and role than in the EU. And there is where it, you know, talking about our accountability, as we said before, well, you have different levels of accountability, right? You have political accountability, but you have also judicial accountability. And there is, and we are seeing now the European courts taking perhaps a more active role also. You know, this depends a little bit on what the parties do, whether they go to court or not. But definitely there is a more a higher inclination to go to the court to deal with cases, even in the merger cases, which before was almost non-existent, right?
Yeah,
Thank you.
maybe to add on that, so go ahead, Ingrid.
I'll be short. I mean, I don't think necessarily. I mean, I would say, I'm not sure that judges are being brainwashed. Just to comment on something that Tommaso said. Then all of us are brainwashed, right? We're all smart people with a lot of experience looking at things. Different opinions may govern, right? We may have different views. I'm not sure judges are so easily brainwashed. I also think that I would agree with Salome that the US system works relatively well with a court-based approach. Of course, it has allowed the enforcement apparatus to be much more political because there is a court system behind it. So everyone's very well aware that certain thresholds apply before you can enforce and implement, which we have much less. There is a much less of a court barrier for enforcement. And so I think there's therefore much less concern about enforcement being somewhat political in the US because you have the court system to go through, and the court will ultimately do their kind of litmus test of whether it falls in or doesn't fall in the trap. So I wouldn't want to dismiss the role of the court here. And again, it's interesting to observe that there's not been a lot of force put into, we should have a maybe digital specialized section in the courts. Maybe we need a better court apparatus that is moving faster, and maybe bringing action isn't so much, you know, some political, just seeing the comments in the chat, some, you know, political parliament member asking why the commission has gone slow. Maybe we need ability for people to have more interim measures type of approach before the courts for action or for inaction. If there's no action by the commission, then someone can bring a procedure. And why not look at a more active role of the courts? I found that always puzzling in looking at the developments over the past year or so in the digital sphere.
So you may not like my colorful words, but and don't like that judges have been brainwashed. I mean, this is just my way of expressing in simple language. I can be even more colorful if you want. There is evidence. There is evidence. There's people who have studied the judges who've been through the so-called Manne training program in economics, and see what they were doing before and after, what kind of sentences, not just in antitrust. And these people have become extremely harsh. They started sentencing people for smaller crimes. They've been extremely lenient on the corporation. So I'm not talking about a personal opinion. There is work which has been done. I personally witnessed also the influence that those institutes, those think tanks have, such as the Global Antitrust Institute. There is another one in Portland. So I've been only to a couple of events, and and I've personally sat next to 3 judges of the Supreme Court of the United States. And no one has that kind of influence. Okay, the difference between and there is articles in the New York Times about overt corruption, inviting people in nice places. So we cannot just always, rub off, ignore. Okay, Tommaso is a colorful character. This is happening. This is happening, and we are part of that system, all of us. Okay, don't forget that. So the difference between the US and the EU, according to my experience, is that in Europe, when it comes to public officials, there is much less revolving doors, which is good. Okay, it's the only occasion that people go back to the private sector. Instead, without any single exception, all those in the front office of the DOJ and the FTC, they spend their own DOJ, FTC capital making calls to former buddies, and then they are going to go back to some law firm when they finish. And I heard personally people telling me, I'm here at the DOJ for a couple of years, 3 years. I'm just waiting for the good enough offer to go back to the private sector. And this is part of the big problem. So Europe, at least, doesn't have that level of revolving doors and corruption. So if you want me to be more colorful, that's what it is. That instead is more prominent in the United States.
I'd like to comment, but I want to leave others to jump in here as well. So Jonathan, let us know how you want to.
Let me give you the reference to the Pitofsky article, which people were asking about. I'm afraid I'm old enough to remember when it came out. I was already in DG Comp. It's Robert Pitofsky, Pitofsky. It's called The Political Content of Antitrust, published in the University of Pennsylvania Law Review in 1979, volume 127 at page 1051. If you want more, I'm afraid you have to go to Tommaso for the economic literature. For the legal literature, which tends to be more American than European, which is interesting, on this general subject, by all means, contact me. I have files of this stuff on my shelf somewhere. Let's perhaps move on because time is advancing and we have a number of interesting further questions. Aoife White asked the question, which I think we've touched on, about prioritization timing. Is that a legal issue? Is that a legal issue which can be challenged? How can there be accountability and scrutiny of the ways in which some sectors are given priority, some are not, some decisions are delayed, some are not, how much explanation is given of all of that? Stephen Kinsella says, I think we all know that if you really want to upset DG Comp, you get an MEP to ask a question about lack of progress. Surely there should be a better, more transparent mechanism than that. Joost van Eersel, how do you see the paradox in the US? No serious competition policy. I think that's a little harsh. The principle of the winner takes all. What lessons can be learned from that? John Davis put out, my colleague at Brunswick, full disclosure, former distinguished lawyer at Freshfields, Antitrust needs to be predictable to maintain credibility. Politics can play a role in prioritization, as it did, for example, in the single market project back in the 80s and 90s, but should not play an important role in outcomes. Should Gazprom have been fined? Should a European champion be permitted in a given case, but not in others? While I'm on it, I will carry on with questions. Apple, as the EU considers new tools and tests, including ones not based on dominance, how effective will the courts be in providing a check and balance mechanism where there is less legal history, at least to start with? And points to, or somebody points to, an article, Ideas Have Consequences, The Impact of Law and Economics on American Justice, by Ash, Chen, and Naidu. And finally, Julia Anderson, a research analyst at Bruegel. I often hear that in Europe, at least, regulation is more subject to political capture than competition. Does the panel agree?
I mean, I'm happy to take John Davis's point, who, by the way, is formerly Freshfields, not formally distinguished, just to be clear. But on internal market, I mean, I think linking that to
for the record, I agree completely. Sorry, John.
To link that into Ingrid's points, which on court, which I think are really interesting as well. So, I mean, the EU courts, I mean, obviously they played a central role in creating the internal market, actually also in making competition law what it is today. And so we all sort of studied that being, I mean, great, because they created Europe, etc. And that was sort of a generation in the court of judges who did not shy away from these kind of political moves, if you want. And then I think it's fair to say that there's been a period where maybe that's been less pronounced, and where the role of the court became more technical. I think for it to, in a way, become more political, however you want to define that role, I mean, they have all the scope, they can do that, and there are links in the treaty to whether it's sustainability or workers' rights. I mean, you can do all this stuff, but I think it then requires what Ingrid referred to as sort of much more immediate involvement as well, whether that is through interim measures, etc. So just to throw it out there, I mean, the question is, should also the courts in a way be more courageous in establishing what is the democratically decided political agenda, and how do we interpret the laws in line with that agenda? And that is, of course, something that evolves over time. But I don't think that the judges are, if they do that, that they are sort of captured or whatever.
Responding to Julia from Bruegel, so is regulation more subject to political capture than antitrust? Let's talk about capture in general, not just political. So, and the answer is yes, and it's quite easy to understand why regulators have repeated clients over and over. So the system of revolving doors in regulation is much more common than antitrust. Antitrust instead one day deals with cement, together with pharma, the third day with supermarkets. So it's less easy to subject competition authorities from that perspective, which is important. An area I think of continuous disagreement with Ingrid has to do with this epiphany. Well, or maybe we agree. We agree actually. So there hasn't been an epiphany, because I still see within the competition bubble a stronger reluctance to accept that changes have happened. Okay? And there's a continuous look for defensive. Now you call it complexity, and we can use another title. But I would say that for some people instead, an epiphany has happened. The Overton window has changed, so now it's acceptable to talk about it, but I haven't seen lots of soul searching from inside the profession, to be honest. And as for, going forward, again, thinking aloud, that's the only thing I do. I'm working on no cases. A few things can happen. I believe in the competition. So perhaps one way forward is by making sure that there are competing institutions. Okay? This may lead to fragmentation. There is a downside, but if there are overlapping turfs, then it's more difficult to have interest groups capture regulators and enforcers, because it becomes too difficult to capture everybody. The other area, which I think is a more interesting one going forward, is this is paradoxical to, coming from an economist. And by the way, I'm a very orthodox economist based on first principle. I've done all my publications, etc. I think we should rely less on economics, okay? So, because economics has proven itself to be very dangerous for the discourse. I would put in a room some economists, because the way we have applied economics is a terrific subject. It's incredibly interesting. Is incredibly rich. But the way we use economics has become so narrow, which I'm surprised. And we should put in the room people with different competences. I want to have computer scientists. I want to have anthropologists. I want to have economists. I want to have competition lawyers. But then come up with a revamp of rebuttable presumptions, because this is going to give the certainty you need. Okay? And the presumptions are great. I think we abandon too much presumption, and then we put ourselves in a world where everything can happen. And then it's basically power which is leading decisions rather than analysis. So we should strongly refocus our attention on rebuttable presumptions that we lost too long ago. And in my view, that's the way to go.
Can I maybe come in there and comment? I think maybe we found one point of agreement, which is that there is a declining role of for economics, I think, in antitrust enforcement, because it is much more difficult to measure. I mentioned that earlier. I thought maybe in the processes we're discussing, picking up one of the questions raised as to how enforcement by courts will happen on tools like the DMA when there is no dominance requirement, for example. I think that I do worry about that, because what competition authority will still try to establish dominance if they don't really have to, right? So I think it's a very much of a sliding scale as to what conduct will be assessed as being problematic. And then the question is it better then to leave that with the competition agency to decide to, bring action, rather than have a kind of a basic framework that gets applied? It leaves a lot more discretion, a lot more leeway to a competition agency, which has been appointed but is not fully kind of elected in that way. So it's not much better than a court system. And I would argue, just to say, the bias that you think judges may be subject to, and I know about the research, when you put judges, you give them a benchmark before, and then you get them to ask about a sentence, they come out higher if you benchmark a different number earlier on. But no one's immune to that, right? And we're not saying that competition officials or even elected officials are actually going to be immune to that. We have to rely on everyone's sensibility. I do worry about kind of requiring less evidence and less framework when there isn't a role for economics, right? When it's much more about a broader scale where there's much less scientific evidence. And in that context, lowering the thresholds is a bit of we have to see how it's going to go, and we have to see how this is going to develop. But it's not necessarily always going to come out in the right way, I would fear.
I mean, to go back to the controversy about brainwashing, judges, if they're any good at judging, should listen to all the arguments made to them in weighing up whatever the case is. And surely, therefore, if one branch of economics is being ignored, or the general profession of economics is not being brought to bear fully, or perhaps has too prominent a role. Or I agree with Tommaso completely. Anthropologists, I remember this from my time in the Commission working on financial regulation in the financial crisis 2008 and onwards. Anthropologists had very interesting things to say about human behavior. And after all, what we are so often looking at is human behavior and trying to assess things that have impacts on it and how it may change in the future. But surely then it is just as, again, I remember when economists played a minor role in competition law, just as lawyers opened up to economics and economics became a competition policy profession, with all the drawbacks that we've seen in that professionalization, surely there is scope for other arguments to be brought to bear in cases before the Commission and in cases before the courts and other jurisdictions around the world. It's up to you, us, companies involved to find the best arguments to support what they want or what they don't want. And that may well include disciplines going further than those represented around this table. We're going to have to wrap up in a minute, but I have a couple of remaining questions from Oles and from Joost, who already asked questions about smaller companies. Are we saying, is anyone saying that the ideal market structure is a larger number of smaller companies? And if that is so, what does that say about Europe's competitive stature in the wider world?
Jonathan, first I want to say something in relation to what you said. So judges should listen to all the cases, the new evidence, the new economics, but we have to run cases. The problem is that there is a lack of risk appetite from the Commission. The Commission, the legal service doesn't want to lose cases in court, and we should help the Commission not to have a stigma on that, because winning 99% of the cases in court is not good, because it means you're not taking enough risk precisely in those complex areas we're dealing with, the new markets we are dealing with. So you need, otherwise we are always caught in a catch-22 situation. We don't run a case, we don't have a precedent, we don't run the next case either. So we need to take some, it's not even a risk by definition, it's policy choices which are uncertain. Otherwise it would be automatic. There would be an algorithm that would give us what's the optimal solution. Instead there are gray areas, and it's only by running cases. And so that's why we have to lower those thresholds and do things. Because we cannot also forget the numbers. We keep discussing. I started giving, I don't know, a talk 3 years ago when I counted that there had been 700 acquisitions in the digital space by the GAFAM, and 0 ever been blocked, and 98% not even looked into. And now 3 years later, we are approaching 950 acquisitions still, with 97% not even ever having been looked into, and 0 having been prohibited. So we are still there. We're not moving the bar at all, okay? And Fitbit is going to be approved in the next couple of weeks. We are not taking any risks because of inertia, because of, I don't know, insecurity, because of lobbying, I would say, and a lot of other instances. So back to Joost and Oles, look at China, okay? China is interesting, perhaps because the power of the political or the central Communist Party is being challenged by the economic power of some of these platforms. But China has also realized that the power of those digital platforms, the economic power, is not good enough for innovation, and they've proposed a legislation quite quickly, which is very, very stringent about digital platforms, because maybe it's a Darwinian word that they want. They understand that monopolies are not good for innovation. So they're opening up networks. They have line of business restrictions. All those things that we don't even envisage in Europe is exactly happening right now in China, because they want to keep being at the forefront of technological innovation. So we helped with technological innovation 20 years ago by blocking the extension of market power of the digital giants back then, which was Microsoft. Okay. And for the first 10 years, it was great, but now we are in a different place. And we have to see that the next generation, and I don't know if it's going to be 20 or less, I have no idea about the right number, but I know for sure that without an ex-ante regulation which allows the potential European company to thrive on the shoulders of the existing giants, that kind of innovation will never happen. Instead, if you open up, and we've experienced it in telecoms, we tried, of course, we helped entrants, in fact, for many years. Not everyone survived, but now with 3-4 different competitors in each country, we are in a better place compared to where we could have been without those regulations. It's not ideal, we're still perfecting it at the margin, etc. But definitely if I compare our European approach to the US, that after the Trinco decision, you cannot open up any incumbent whatsoever because this is against the constitution, then they have basically monopolies and duopolies everywhere and the highest prices in the world. So I think the European model worked out much better.
I think we could go on all day. These are very interesting subjects. Unfortunately, it is nearly 11:15 here in Brussels. And therefore time to wrap up. I thank you all. I thank the audience for enthusiastic participation, judging by the chat box. The panelists were great. Thank you all very much. All I can say as a man of my age, when I joined the European Commission in 1978, if you had told me that competition policy would be at the heart of a discussion about the future of the European economy, future of European society, I would have been delighted. These are very important subjects. I would have been less delighted to know that my country was no longer a member state, but that's for another panel. The importance of competition policy cannot be overestimated, and I think we've had a very rich discussion here today. I'm grateful to all of the panelists. Thank you to Forum Europe for partnering us in this. I wish you all a very good day.